Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm doing a book review for Quiet by Susan Cain, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. So this is going to be a little bit different to a lot of my book reviews on this channel because I'm not limiting myself to 360 seconds, basically because I'm pretty sure I'm going to be ranting about this book for quite a while in this video. I really did not enjoy this book, which again makes it quite different to a lot of my book reviews because I normally only review a book when I have very positive things to say about it. I do think this book is an instance of like pseudo-intellectual self-help book masquerading as pop science that I really think gives a bad name to non-fiction in general, and I just think that it kind of committed a few author-based sins that I just really wasn't happy with, and I wanted to talk in more detail on my channel with a separate review video to it because I didn't want it to like take over my next wrap-up. So what is Quiet about? Quiet is a non-fiction book that is putting forward the idea that basically introverts are an overlooked subcategory of human, a kind of a way of dividing the world, and the extroverts are always the ones who come out on top and the introverts are the ones that really we should be trying to prioritize and be able to make more space for introverts to be able to be heard. Now, I have kind of four major issues with this book and I'm going to go through them in a second. And what I want to say before I get started is if you are someone who identifies as an introvert, has read this book and found a lot of solace in it, I do not want to try and take that away from anybody. I think that it is important when you kind of find something where you see yourself in that thing, that like if this has made you feel better about how you exist in the workspace, if you're someone who suffers from like social anxiety and this has made you feel better about that as well, like fantastic. But I do think that Susan Cain's kind of overarching way of viewing the world, the worldview that she's putting forward, the argument that she's making here does not work. And whilst on an individual basis I never want to take anything away from anybody, I think that when you're an author purporting a book like this that is trying to make kind of more sweeping statements about society, actually you need to be held accountable for those statements. So what did I not like about Quiet? So my first point was the lack of useful definitions for both introvert and extrovert. So at the very, very back of the book, Susan Cain does say that she's trying to use a like cultural definition of what introvert and extrovert mean, because there's a lot of different ways that you can interpret that, and she basically goes through the entire gambit of the various different interpretations you can have of these terms, whether it be extrovert being a performative thing or a confidence thing or a public speaking thing or just somebody who like thrives from social settings, and an introvert being something which is like a socially anxious thing, a shy thing, someone who just finds people very tiring, or somebody who claims to be almost like a pseudo extrovert who kind of puts on an extroverted persona for their workplace but actually prefers a quiet night in. Now my problem with all of these different terminologies is that basically if you're trying to do any kind of definitional work, you really need to pick something, because when you use your terms to apply to such a wide range of different behaviours, they kind of become quite meaningless, and I think that the line becomes very, very blurred. We also bump into the problem of the fact that introvert and extrovert are labels which you can only really get information from by like self-reporting, so it doesn't really tell you anything about the individual's behaviour when we're doing these studies on like introverts do this and extroverts do that, rather than comparing like a genuine like introvert and extrovert that you can kind of have any sort of empirical grounding in. You're just comparing people's perceptions of their own individual behaviour, of who self-identifies as an introvert and extrovert. And one thing that really stood out to me as like an example of this, many of the studies, the way that they were described, I was like, I do not think this methodology is sound. I do not think that this is working very well at all. But one of them was they got introverts to pretend to be extroverts hosting like a maths lesson or something, and they then videoed that behaviour and then compared it to genuine extroverts who were then pretending to like host a maths lesson or whatever and doing like the same kind of role play scenario, and then they kind of compared the two behaviours. But there was nothing that was ever said as to how they gathered the introverts and separated them out from the extroverts. So there was nothing that really meaningfully said the difference between someone who identifies as an introvert pretending to have extroverted behaviour and someone who is genuinely an extrovert. And I just think that you're stumbling into these like, we can't know each person's like individual inner lives, so this is all starting to get very meaningless. So that was kind of number one problem, was the lack of like solid definitional work that was going on for like the real foundational stuff from this book. But even if we had been able to get a clear idea of introvert extrovert, I think that Susan Cain is not doing enough work in many areas to make this thing actually work. For one thing, she's super reductive, which that is kind of a classic in these very self-helpy style books, which I'm sorry, this is a self-help book. This is not pop science. I don't care what somebody says. It's self-help, business, pseudo-intellectual nonsense. And she is very much reducing absolutely everything down to this introvert-extrovert dichotomy, which just ignores a huge range of extraneous factors. She talks about the extroversion of the corporate world, and I think you could make an equally compelling argument that actually the traits that we value within like the corporate world, especially corporate America, because obviously it is a very American-centric book, they all are, and so you could argue that the traits that we kind of favour are actually masculine coded. It's all about being assertive and loud and really putting your voice forward. And actually, is that somebody who's an extrovert who just has a loud voice and is happy to speak up? Or is that somebody who is trying to match up to a sense of like privilege and entitlement, who believes that their voice has value and should always be heard? Like, I do think that there is definitely something there, and this book does not touch on it at all. It barely touches on discussions of race. You do often get the idea of, you know, the angry black woman. This book does not do anything with that. It has a chapter on sort of the interaction between like West and specifically like East Asian sort of ideals about introversion or extroversion, but like, you know, when you're just reading something and you think to yourself, like, I can't fully unpack exactly why I'm unhappy with how you're talking about everything here, because I don't feel like I am kind of equipped in terms of sort of racial language to fully understand what's making me feel so gross right now. But it felt very weird and very uncomfortable, and I just feel like it was not done very well. So I'm sure that there are other reviewers out there who can unpack that, but they definitely did not explore like the range of different factors there. And it was also reducing just like very specific microcosms of instances down to this introversion extroversion, including at one point trying to put forward that the financial crisis and like the Enron scandal might have been averted if there had been fewer extroverts in the business and more introverts who felt comfortable to speak up, which, like, that was a huge case of white collar crime. That was not a case of extroverts blindly stumbling forward and not realizing they're barreling towards a problem. Like, that was a huge, massive scandal based on all sorts of very elaborate criminogenic factors, and there's nothing to do, or not necessarily nothing, but like cannot just be reduced down to this introvert extrovert idea. And I just think that it's not really understanding the full range of different things that kind of can play into this. You know, another thing that I think is really important is actually how much authority does any person have within a role when we're talking about whether it be school or corporate. A good example of this might be, you know, the difficulty we often have in the medical community of lesser trained people or nowhere near as formally trained people like speaking up when something's going wrong, because there is a fear of, like, you know, the doctor is the person with the authority who has all the training in the room, and that's nothing to do with an introversion extroversion split, but you could quite easily make that argument because you're like, all these introverts who don't feel comfortable speaking up. It's like, no, actually it's these people who the doctor is always right, and you've created that kind of aura and mystique around them as a job title that you then, as a like subordinate within the workplace and as a junior, can't talk up against. And to give Cain marginal amounts of credit, she doesn't talk about that in this book, but I think that she's not putting forward the argument that that is the kind of split. But like, I think it's just another example of where actually the introversion extroversion split aligns really nicely with other factors that she just does not address whatsoever. So that was point 2. Point 3 is for somebody who keeps saying like, oh, I don't think that extroverts are completely useless. Honest, like, it is a hugely normative book in nature. It is really putting forward the argument that the introverts are the quiet intellectuals, the creative genius, who if the extroverts would just shut the fuck up and let the introverts get a word in, they would be able to like do more and get more done, and everything would be better. It very much is putting forward this idea of like, introverts are the secret genius who have been constantly overlooked, and I just think that that's just inaccurate. Like, it's completely ignoring a huge like percentage of the population, if you even believe in this split, which I really don't think I do anymore. It's also super elitist in nature. She had this real like weird intellectualism and like intellectual snobbery about how she was discussing people. This idea of like, extroverts love small talk, which is just so frivolous, and like, oh, aren't these shallow people just flit from one person to the other, whereas an introvert will do the deep, meaningful conversations. Introverts are readers. Introverts will take more time over their work and are more detail oriented. And it's just like, no, actually, I think a person could identify as introvert or extrovert dependent entirely on their social setting, and dependent entirely on how much points of commonality you have with those people. Like, I'm somebody who has always considered myself an extrovert for a very long time, but half the people at work would probably say like, Emma, she keeps to herself, she sits in the corner with her headphones on, because I honestly find like the work staff room just a bit too much and a bit overwhelming. And I don't have necessarily as many points of kind of commonality with some of my work colleagues as I do with some of my really close friends, which, like, that's completely fair enough, I think. Like, some of the people who I worked with in my old job and an escape room, which naturally, as you can imagine, attracts a very, like, stereotypically nerdy kind of crowd, half of them would potentially struggle in more of, like, a big party setting, but you put them in a group of people that they know, in terms of, like, they know they have shared common traits with, whether it be a love of board games or D&D or whatever, and they become like the biggest, most bubbly extroverts in the room you've ever seen. And I just don't think it's actually like taking into consideration all of the different, like, the different hats that individuals can wear, and it's just ignoring the, like, performative nature of extroversion. Like, it's not drawing a clear enough line between what we consider to be performance and what we consider to be strict extroversion. So it talked about Tony Robbins, and then it also talked about a different guy who does a lot of public speaking, who apparently tweeted being like, "You won't believe this, but I'm actually an introvert." And it's like, actually, you know, because even though I talk in front of thousands of people, I like to go home and have a quiet night in with my wife. And it's like, how much is this just people playing a role, which we all do in society? So what exactly are we trying to meaningfully latch onto here when we say that introverts need to be given more of a space for a voice? Or is it just that, like, people who code as introverts aren't very good at public speaking or performance elements, and that's something that they can improve on? And I feel like this really, like, neatly leads into my kind of final problem with this book, is I have a real issue with any self-help style book that tries to put forward the idea that your traits in any way, shape or form are fixed. And I think that this book, I was chatting with my friend about it, and she was like, it sounds like it's kind of suggesting that introverts just need to wait for the world to, like, rearrange itself around them. And I was like, yes, it's like, I am a firm believer that ignoring all sorts of socioeconomic factors, there is nothing that you can't change if you want to put your mind to it and you do the adequate, like, the appropriate cost benefit analysis of what it will cost you. Like, if I wanted to, I could learn to play the violin and become very good at it. In theory, it would take hours of practice, it would take an immense amount of money, it would take an immense amount of time, it'd take an immense amount of energy from me, but in theory, if I could line all those things up, absolutely nothing is stopping me from becoming a violin, I wouldn't say as far as, like, virtuoso. Natural talent does go a certain percentage of the way, but, like, I could get dramatically better than what I am now. And I think about this in terms of, like, personality. Like, actually, people can become more patient with practice. People can become, you know, more compassionate with practice. People can become more outspoken with practice, can get better at public speaking, can get better at shutting the fuck up and listening to other people, can get better at many, many things. Myself now, in comparison to myself as a teenager, I have infinite more amounts of patience. I'm much better at holding my tongue. I have a much better poker face. I'm much better at picking my battles. I'm much less of an annoying know-it-all. And I know that seems incredible to think, given how much I witter on my channel, but I am much better at taking the back seat, because it's something that I knew was something that was getting in the way of things that I wanted, so I actively worked on it. But this book kind of is leaning more towards the idea of, like, you're an introvert, this is what you are fixed, and life is about just finding ways to make your environment align with what you need, rather than acknowledging that you can make any changes. It talked about, once you realize the style of introvert that you are, you can make changes in your career and your friendships to align more closely with what you think. And, like, this idea that we're just constantly trying to, like, uncover more of the mystical true self within, to be able to make everything in our environment line up to, like, the actual person that we are inside, rather than acknowledging that, like, the self is this constantly evolving thing, that for a while something will work for you and then it just stops working. And, like, actually, if your job is something that you no longer get satisfaction from, that doesn't negate any of the years where you did get satisfaction from it. You weren't wrong about yourself in those times where you enjoyed it. It's just that what your needs have changed, your views have changed, how you interact with the world has changed, and you're looking for something different, and that's totally okay. And I just don't think this book gives any room for any real emotional growth from the individual, because it's all about just, like I said, like, uncovering the inner person. So I think that's everything. I've had a bit of a rant. I've been ranting about this book for now like several weeks. I wrote like a Goodreads review. I was complaining about every other chapter to my partner, who, Andy, is so happy I finished this book. He was like, I'm so sick of hearing about that fucking book, Quiet. I was like, I agree with you. And I had a really long chat with my mate Catherine, who has not read it, but on purpose decided not to read it because of basically how much nonsense it sounded, way before I ever spoke to her about it. And yeah, I wanted to give this book the space that it deserved for me to talk about it. And like I said at the beginning, if you're somebody who is an introvert or is socially anxious or identifies as an introvert, and you read this book and you found a lot of real comfort and solace in it, absolutely fine, power to you. I just think that the argument that she's putting forward in terms of like how we should rearrange the world to suit introverts, and how like introverts are this untapped potential, is just meaningless if you don't define the terms, super reductive, super normative, and it's just entirely self-limiting on the individual. And actually, the general conclusion that people should be allowed to interact with the working world and the school world and the learning environment in a way that best suits them in that moment, to be given moments of quiet when they need it, to have group work when they need it, to have the ability to not necessarily need to speak up in front of people, to be able to like put input in without needing to be physically there, etc, etc. I 100% agree with everything. I just disagree with every single premise Susan Cain has used to try and come to this conclusion. So on that absolute bummer of a note, I hope you're having a wonderful reading week, and I will chat to you soon. Bye!